Okay, so here we are again, and once more, I want to talk about trans issues, which is interesting in itself because of the handful of times where I've discussed trans issues on YouTube. Almost always another video has followed in quick succession, because I suppose you could talk, there's lots of talk, isn't there, online about privilege and the privileges we have. I think this is probably a very genuine example of that I have the privilege of distance from the impact of the issues, that for me, I can indulge in what are the fascinating aspects of this particular discussion without having to deal with it on a sort of ground level that you would have to deal with, I suppose, if you were transgendered or if you knew somebody very closely, intimately, who was transgendered. But resulting from the video that I made the other day, there was some quite interesting discussion points that I wanted to bring up and to discuss, because honestly, I think that the trans issue is one that is not clear cut, and the nature of the discussion is clouded in so many things and stifled in some ways, which I can understand from some people's perspective why they regard that as a good thing. But it's frustrating from my perspective when, looking from the perspective that I see, I can see the real questions that are worth discussing, that are open for discussion. They are open questions. They're not questions, actually, despite what some people would say, that we have answers for, because some of the questions are not questions of scientific fact, but of linguistics and how we as individuals and society choose to categorize things, which are, we love the expression, don't we, or at least people involved in these things do, social constructs. And it's impossible to claim that something, on the one hand, is a social construct, largely a social construct, and at the other hand, say it's a matter of scientific fact and beyond dispute. But one of the things that I think typifies this discussion is mean-spiritedness, I would say. This is something that I've observed, and tell me if you think I'm wrong. But I think that whilst there are people out there that have legitimate issues with the whole trans debate and trans acceptance thing, at the same stage, there is a shit ton of mean-spiritedness. And I often feel that I read comments or hear people talk who are skeptical of the trans side, and I get the impression, this is my impression, that's what it is, it's my impression that underpinning their arguments is a mean-spiritedness. And I can tell you from a personal level, I rail against that. And that leads me to adopt certain positions, which I will freely admit to you now, under other circumstances I would be a little bit more circumspect about and would not accept. And some people, for example, following the last video, talked about why I'm so free to accept using somebody's pronouns, or accepting that however they describe themselves is how they describe themselves. And it is true, as I shall outline in a couple of minutes, that generally that is not the way that I carry about my affairs. And that does provide a certain amount of sort of dissonance for me, and a little bit of uncomfiness that I'm doing that, and I'm trying to set one thing against another. I think on the one hand, part of the legitimate discussion is that there is this mean-spiritedness, and people maybe... it was talked about in terms of what Amelia Jane had said in that thing, in terms of concern trolling and coming out with concerns when they are not actually the legitimate underlining concerns, and things being used effectively as a kind of battering ram for this, as I portrayed it, mean-spiritedness. But I do think there are legitimate answers and areas of concern, one of which would be of supposed linguistic concerns in terms of how we use language. Despite the fact that some people seem to believe that there are objective definitions to words like man and woman, there really isn't. And to say, no, you are objectively using that word wrong, is actually somewhat absurd. And yet that is how far down that rabbit hole we have gone in terms of policing the usage of the terms man and woman. In the UK, the police actually visiting people's homes and contacting them for non-crimes of using those words in the wrong way. That's how far that has gone. And then there are also categorisation. concerns, which concern effectively how we go about categorising people, and that's seen in a very objectionable light if you're not doing it the right way with this subject, and yet it's up, the balls are up in the air the same as they are with so many other subjects. What are some of the concerns that I have? And I say this as somebody who, as I detailed at the beginning of the last video, and I will say it again, I am quite happy to go along with how people want to identify. If you want to identify as a man, or you want to identify as a woman, and you want me to use the pronouns that are appropriate for that, or you regard yourself as neither a man or a woman, or a man one day and a woman the next, whatever, if I can remember to do so, I will do so. I do take the hump quite quickly for people that have very, very high expectations in terms of how much memory time I'm going to put to one side just for them as an individual, right, if I get it wrong, but I will do my best within the scope of you being one person amongst tens of thousands that flash upon my retinas on a monthly basis, right. I will try and remember as best that I can. But at the same stage, I think one of the legitimate questions is how far down that rabbit hole do we go? And are we going to get to a point where the words man and woman effectively become meaningless, which would chime in with the idea of a linguistic concern? After all, let's take a sort of very, very extreme example here. Let's take somebody who did all the things that we would typically regard as associating with a woman. They behave very stereotypically in a feminine manner. They had a woman's name, a woman's mannerisms. They dressed as we would normally expect for a woman. They had female external genitalia. They produced everything that we would regard with females, femininity, and women. Typically, okay, the most sort of girly woman that you could imagine, sort of thing, but they wished to be regarded, they regard themselves, perhaps genuinely, let's say, absolutely genuinely, they regard themselves as a man, and they wish to identify as a man. And this is an interesting thing, because the discussion is framed in terms of self-identification, but really it isn't, is it? Because if it was just about self-identification, then that's great. But really, when people talk about self-identification, what they're talking about is actually how they expect others to identify them. It's not just simply about, well, I wish to identify as this, and if you want to identify me as something else, crack on. It's not about that. So if you get to that stage, where do we go with that? If somebody who is that typically feminine wishes to identify as a man and genuinely feels that they want to identify as a man, is that okay, or has that gone beyond some sort of soft limit? And if it hasn't gone beyond some sort of soft limit, and we're all happy to go along with that, right, and say if you want to identify as a man and you're the most girly girl of all time, then that's okay. What does that mean for the definitions of man and woman? I mean, I think that's a legitimate concern to have, right? The definitions of man and woman, if those words are going to have some utility within our society, which is why we use words in the first place, then they need to have some kind of meaning that has some consistency between one individual and the next. And if you entirely lose that, then the word becomes meaningless. And that's got to be a concern when our words become meaningless. It's always been a tricky thing with regard to the words man and woman, and what does it mean to be a man and what does it mean to be a woman? And I think we all have to take on board the fact that there's always been some porosity at the borders of those things. I think if we look back in history, it's probably true that throughout most of history, the words man and woman and Whiffman and Werman, it's the other way around, Werman and Whiffman, have been used in a context of an understanding that we regard them as a human man and a human male and a human female. And I have no problem with trying to give them a different context now and look at it in terms of gender identity. And as I would see it, the genderization of the brain frequently during our development in the womb. But once you go beyond that and just make it a business of self-identification, aren't you in danger somewhere down the line of coming to a point where that's absolutely fine and everybody identifies as whatever they want, but those identities become utterly meaningless? It doesn't, man no longer means anything at all, and woman suddenly doesn't mean anything whatsoever. There's nothing coherent or consistent that is attached to those words anymore. I propose that, for example, is a legitimate question to ask. Okay, it might be within this sort of, this haze of mean-spiritedness that this question gets approached, but to say, as a result of that, we need to take that question off the table, I think is unwarranted. I don't think that's a path that I would be happy to go down. Of course, one of the problems with that we need to acknowledge with regard to the mean-spiritedness and questions of this kind is that questions of this kind can be made in a mean-spirited context. And then we bring in the extra layer, don't we, of things like the suicide rates for trans people, which are undeniably far higher than they are for the general population. But at the same stage, that can be oversold, because the implication is that those suicide rates are only so high because of the situation within society, whereas it's not clear-cut that that's entirely the case. If you are suffering from gender dysphoria, and let's be honest, people are always going to suffer from it. It's never going to be a nice thing that you are brought up in an environment where you're associated one way, maybe associate yourself one way, and then you go through a process of transition. Right? You're not trans unless you've gone through a process of transition, and a process of transition is always stressful, and a significant personal transition is always going to be especially stressful. So we then get into the sort of case of, well, so what percentage of that suicide rate and the problems that trans people suffer from is as a result of society and the way that society deals with them, and what part of it is as a result of things that are intrinsic to their very being and the process that they have gone through or are going through or are considering going through. So that's one of the big things for me, which is this understanding of where do we go with this in terms of man and woman. For me, there is still some clear water. There is still a way that we can define this, which is in terms of biological sex being defined as we've talked about in terms of gametes, and gender being defined in terms of the state of your brain, the sexualization, if you like, of your brain, which takes place during development in the womb. But what that does mean is you have to sacrifice some element of self-identification there, that it isn't simply however you want to identify, but it is literally a case of you are born with a male body, but you haven't effectively got a typically male brain there. So that is a bit of, I suppose, a bit of a split where I would have from some people on the trans side of that. The other thing is this issue which I mentioned earlier, and I said I would go back to in terms of self-identification versus the identification of others. And this is somewhere where I find a certain amount of dissonance here, because I am very much promoting, a lot of people disagree with me on my videos, but that's fine, promoting the business of accepting trans people by their own identification. You could say going along with it in some cases, because from my perspective, when I look at somebody, I make a decision for themselves, whether I categorise them as a man or a woman, and sometimes I will use the pronouns that don't fit in with my own little personal categorisation of them. Now, some people will be horrified by that. Oh my God, you're a bigot after all. No, Plum, I can't believe it. You need casting into several pits of hell. But I'm afraid that is kind of how things work, right? And that's probably as good as you are going to get, is for people effectively, superficially, to recognise that is how you wish to be regarded and speak to you in that manner. because it is a thing that goes way beyond the whole trans business here, which is that we really accept and have to accept that how we identify people and how we label people may not match up with how they label themselves, and how we regard ourselves may not match up with their identifications. And this is something that I feel I'm on pretty solid ground to say for myself, because I've talked about this in the past and always made. One thing that people, I would hope, would say with regard to me, other than the fact that you talk shit, Noel, is that I try and be consistent. And I think I've tried to be consistent here. I've talked about feminism before, and what I've said is, I don't regard myself as a feminist. But if under your definition of feminism, I qualify as a feminist, I have no problem with you labelling me as a feminist. So if your definition of feminism is a very sort of milquetoast, broad brush, somebody who believes in equality of opportunity for men and women, or males and females, or however you want to dress it up, and you say, well, you're saying you believe in that, Noel, therefore I identify you as a feminist, I have no problem with that. I'm not going to say, no, you have to identify me as I identify me, and I don't identify with that label for other reasons, because I think it brings more baggage and it brings more misunderstanding than it cures. I'm not going to tell you, no, you have to either, well, it would mean you'd have to either do one of two things, wouldn't it? Alter your definition of feminism, even though you think that your definition of feminism is the right definition, is the best definition, is the definition that it suits your purposes to work towards, which would be a ridiculous thing for me to suggest you have to do, or to say to you, well, you can stick by that definition, but you have to sort of still acknowledge that I don't fit into it, even though I do fit into it, which would be a frustratingly ridiculous claim for me to have to make. And that goes on to my other example, which is the whole business of atheism, which does impact on me because it's something I talk about a great deal. And one of the things that I've pointed out in the past is that in the terms of the UK, only something like 10%, 15% of the population identify as being an atheist. And yet I identify about 60% of the population as being an atheist. What's the reason for this? The reason for this is that my definition of atheism isn't somebody who says they're an atheist. It's somebody that does not believe in a god or gods. Let's not get into that lack of belief versus disbelief thing. That's not relevant to this discussion. Right, you can phrase it exactly however you wish, but the point is that my definition is related to a belief, a disbelief, a lack of belief. It isn't related to self-identification. And about 60% of the population in the UK does not believe in a god or gods. Ergo, for my definition, I categorise them as atheists, whether or not they call themselves atheists. Now, I accept freely. If you don't want to call yourself an atheist, that's up to you. And I'm not going to say that you have to go around identifying as an atheist. But at the same stage, I'm not going to change my definition to be anybody who calls themselves an atheist is an atheist. Anybody who doesn't call themselves an atheist isn't an atheist. Because effectively, then the word atheism would lose all meaning. And it would lose all traction for the purposes for which I use the word. So I've come to a little happy place for me over the years, and this is something that's taken place while I've been on YouTube, whereas I now differentiate, and I'm happy to differentiate between the terms people apply to themselves and the terms that I apply to them. And if it doesn't match up, if I categorise them one way and they categorise themselves a different way, I'm quite happy with that, right? I'm not going to get a whole load of consternation about that. It's just not going to happen anymore. I'm happy with that. I think that's quite a reasonable set of circumstances. So you can see why there's some dissonance for me, because in terms of this situation here, we have a situation where effectively, because I can see a certain amount of mean-spiritedness underpinning other people's arguments, I'm almost suspending my own rules and saying we should just kind of go along with however somebody wants to be identified. If they want to regard themselves as a man, then we all have to categorise them as a man. If they all regard themselves as a woman, we all have to categorise them as a woman. And in my heart of hearts, I don't really believe that, right? So I suppose what I'm saying is it needs to be, for me, maybe a little bit performative. And I'm advocating that people are a little bit performative with this. So if you want to have set definitions for man and woman, that's absolutely okay. And if the definitions you have, you say, no, I want to stick to probably how these words were originally defined and were defined up until very recently, which was that, and in many cases, if you look at a definition for man and woman, it will say male human, female human. If you want to say with that, I don't think that in itself is intrinsically a bigoted position, and it's a perfectly rational position to hold. I don't think that's the best way of utilising these words, but at least the words still have some utility, whereas if we strip it of everything, if we deny any kind of innateness and gendering of the brain that underpins things, and we just sort of say, well, it's just a business of self-identification and that's it, then I think you do strip these words almost of every meaning whatsoever. Okay, there was one more thing that I wanted to talk. I think already those are good talking points, and I'd be interested to know what people think. But the second thing is this business that's saying there's two genders is the worst thing in the world that you could say, and that in itself is transphobic. And whilst it's not something that, it's not an expression that I find a very accurate portrayal of the spectrum of the way gender expresses within people, right? It's not a particularly helpful way of doing it. I don't think there's any number of genders that you can give me that is a more accurate number than 2, right? So if you say there's 3 genders or there's 20 genders or whatever, I don't find them any more edifying or representing reality or having more utility than saying there's only 2 genders. And I also don't think that fundamentally, whilst that may be said quite often for mean-spirited reasons, fundamentally I don't think it is transphobic to say it, and I'll explain why. The 2 genders, such as they are, in the traditional way of viewing things, are man and woman. I think we would all agree, every single one of us, that man and woman are pretty broad categories, right? If you look at the array of people who categorise themselves, let's say, as men, right, and how they express their manhood, their masculinity, their manliness, it is a bewildering array of different things. It's not as if you're defining a single narrow band here. You are defining a huge swathe. Being a man is a huge swathe of different gender expressions, if you like, all under that one category of man. And the same thing would hold true with woman. In many ways, maybe even broader with women, in that traditionally in our societies, I think women get away with behaving in stereotypically male masculine ways more than men do in stereotypically women's ways, both in terms of the way they dress. You could wear a dress, or you could wear a skirt, the way they style their hair, the way they behave, etc., etc. Tell me if you think I'm wrong with that. But nevertheless, these are huge categories. Not only that, there is considerable, an undeniable overlap, that there are people who identify as a woman whose almost every single attribute of how they identify and how they perform to us, the performative nature of their being within the world, overlaps with some men. Right, so there are some men who seemingly are more on the woman's side than people who identify as women, and people who identify as women more on the sort of masculine side than people who identify as men. I think everybody would be in agreement there. Okay, so in some ways it seems as if, rather than, you can view saying there are only 2 genders as being very narrow, but at the same stage, those genders and people who self-identify under those genders seems to already cover all the available alternatives of gender expressions anyway. So it's almost, you could make the case that any additional ones are almost superfluous. And certainly something that I've made before, a point that I made before, was this idea that effectively, if you look at some of these, what I regard as ridiculous lists of genders, where there's like 50 odd of them, effectively what you've got is man here, woman there, right, covering these huge, bewildering arrays of gender expressions, and then this small gap within the middle that's got 50 odd different categorizations, you know. And to me, that doesn't make any sense at all. That makes less sense than saying there are two genders. So I think that is, again, that's another discussion that has effectively been wiped off the table in some circumstances, would have you regarded as some kind of transphobe, some kind of terrible bigot to have that. And yet I think those are all absolutely legitimate points and arguments that we all ought to be able to have. My personal feelings on that, I'll wrap up with that, is that really talking in terms of how many genders there are is kind of a waste of time, right? Saying there's two genders is no worse than saying there's three genders or four genders or 532 genders. It's kind of meaningless. We have got an array, a spectrum. There is a spectrum of the way that people identify and the way that people present themselves within the world, the way that people act, and the way that people feel about themselves. We all agree on that, right? And so really all we're talking about really is how we choose to categorize and slice and dice it up. Are we going to say there's just hot water and cold water? Or do we want to say there's hot water and warm water and cold water? Or do we need lukewarm water and sort of, you know, quite hot water? This is really effectively what you're talking about. It's not about denying somebody exists or anything ridiculously hyperbolic like that, denying their identity, erasing their identity from existence. It's really about a system of categorisation, and what system of categorisation we as individuals regard as maybe the system that has the most utility within the world in which we live. Okay, really interested to know what people think with regard to that, because these are subjects, regardless of whether or not you think they ought to be contentious, people have decided they have, like I say, to the point where in the UK the police feel they have to get involved even when crimes haven't been committed there. That's how far down the rabbit hole we're going with this. Is it possible that we can draw this situation back to a position where we can actually have sensible conversations about this? Or really, have we got to the point where there is so much anger, so much resentment, and so much tribalism on both sides that it's almost like these subjects are beyond discussion? Okay, thoughts? Interested to know what you think. Thank you for listening to what I've had to say about this. Once again, thank you very much for that. It's a wonderful thing to be able to come on YouTube and to be able to outline my thoughts to so many people. Thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. Bye for now.